On the suffocating night of August 21, 1942, at precisely 11:57 p.m., as rainwater slid from jungle leaves and pooled in shallow depressions across the torn earth of Guadalcanal, Captain John Hightower crouched behind a muddy coral ridge overlooking a narrow jungle clearing, his uniform soaked through, his boots half submerged, steam rising faintly from the ground around him as the heat of the day refused to release its grip, while 200 yards ahead shadows moved between tree trunks. Like living smoke, accompanied by the low murmur of Japanese voices, the metallic clink of equipment, and the unmistakable sound of men assembling with purpose. At 31 years old, Hightower had already learned that Guadalcanal was not merely a battlefield, but a living furnace that punished hesitation and rewarded adaptation, a place where doctrine died quickly and survival depended on improvisation. And beside him, Sergeant Eddie McCullough worked in near silence at the breech of a 37mm M3 anti-tank gun, its steel frame darkened by mud and oil, its barrel pointed into the blackness like an accusation, a weapon conceived in American factories to destroy armor, but here, through necessity and experimentation, transformed into something far deadlier for what was coming. As McCullough chambered an M2 canister round that appeared outwardly unremarkable yet concealed 122 precision-machined steel balls packed tightly within a thin metal casing designed to rupture moments after leaving the muzzle, converting the gun into a direct-fire instrument of annihilation capable of erasing entire formations in seconds. For months, Japanese forces had terrorized Allied defenders across the Pacific with Banzai charges that defied conventional military logic. Massed human waves fueled by centuries of samurai tradition and imperial doctrine that exalted spiritual strength over material odds, tactics that had shattered Chinese divisions, overwhelmed Filipino defenses, and left behind battlefields soaked in blood where survivors whispered of men who advanced screaming into fire without hesitation, absorbing bullets until they reached bayonet distance where numbers and fanatic momentum overwhelmed everything in their path. And every Marine on Guadalcanal had heard those stories and wondered, in quiet moments, whether discipline and firepower would be enough when the jungle finally erupted. Tonight that test had arrived, for more than 1,000. Soldiers of the Japanese 17th Infantry Division were assembling west of Henderson Field, convinced that one overwhelming charge would sweep the exhausted Americans into the sea and reclaim the airfield, whose loss had bled Japanese forces since the landing 6 weeks earlier, an airfield whose possession meant control of the Solomon Islands and potentially the entire southern flank of the Pacific War. The first warning had come at 1800 hours when Marine scouts along the Lunga River reported enemy movement massing in the jungle, intelligence Hightower received while cleaning his gun, the metal still warm from test firing, the message brief but chilling, enemy strength estimated at battalion level, possibly more, advancing eastward under cover of darkness, confirmation that weeks of probing attacks and infiltration had been merely preparation for something far larger. Something General Harakichi Hyakutake had planned meticulously from his command post near the Matanako River, where dwindling supplies, malaria-ridden troops, and starvation rations had pushed Japanese forces toward a decisive gamble, yet one rooted not solely in desperation but in doctrine reinforced by decades of success, a belief that moral force and shock action could overcome firepower, that the emperors will sanctified sacrifice, and that American troops, though well-equipped, lacked the spiritual resolve to withstand true imperial assault. Lieutenant Kenji Okada embodied that belief as he briefed his company beneath dripping jungle canopy, rain turning the ground to black sludge while his men crouched low with bayonets fixed, faces smeared with charcoal, carrying only rifles, grenades, and a handful of cartridges, stripped of anything that would slow them, knowing that once the American line was breached they would seize enemy weapons and complete the destruction, and Okada, a veteran of China, had watched entire nationalist formations dissolve before similar charges, had seen terror spread faster than bullets, and believed with absolute certainty that tonight would be no different. The American defensive line stretched along a low ridge with overlapping fields of fire carefully planned to channel attackers into exposed ground, machine guns dug in at intervals, riflemen positioned to cover dead space, mortars registered on pre-plotted coordinates. And at the center of a natural clearing, roughly 150 yards wide high tow tower, placed his 37mm gun. Understanding that the terrain itself was a weapon, forcing any assault to reveal itself fully, and although the M3 had been designed to defeat Japanese light tanks, those rarely appeared in Guadalcanal's dense jungle, so instead he had spent weeks refining the use of canister ammunition whose thin casing ruptured approximately 50 feet from the muzzle, releasing steel spheres traveling nearly 1,500 feet per second, lethal beyond 200 yards and utterly devastating inside 100, a modern evolution of grape shot perfected by American ordnance engineers who combined historical principles with industrial precision, ensuring uniform dispersion and maximum lethality. Sergeant McCullough understood the weapon's mathematics intimately, calculating cone spread, density, and engagement range, knowing that at optimal distance a single round could neutralize every man across a 60-yard frontage, and he drilled his crew relentlessly until Private Miller could load blindfolded, maintaining rhythm under pressure, while ammunition bearers crouched behind them with waterproof containers holding 30 canister rounds and 20 armor-piercing shells that would remain untouched. For Japanese intelligence had failed entirely to identify the presence of anti-tank guns. In Marine lines, assuming defenders would face the charge with rifles and machine guns alone, threats they believed courage and momentum could overcome. As midnight past the jungle grew unnaturally still, insects falling silent, birds vanishing, Marines checking weapons and whispering final words, and at 0105 hours Japanese units began moving forward, spreading into a broad assault front nearly half a mile wide as whispered commands gave way to chanting that grew louder with every step, a rolling thunder of voices announcing that stealth was over and faith would decide the night. And when Lieutenant Okata raised his sword at 0147 hours and screamed the ancient battle cry, more than 1,000 men surged from the treeline, bayonets glinting faintly, boots splashing through mud and shallow streams, ranks advancing 20 deep as American machine guns opened fire and tracers carved gaps that instantly closed under the pressure of bodies, Captain High Tow Tower watching through binoculars while McCullough waited with disciplined calm until the lead elements reached 125 yards, the distance where dispersion and lethality aligned perfectly, and when he squeezed the trigger the gun recoiled violently, muzzle flash freezing the scene in white light as the canister round burst and 122 steel balls scythed into the densely packed formation, men vanishing mid-stride, torsos collapsing, limbs torn away, momentum carrying shattered. Bodies forward before they slammed into the mud, a 30-yard swath of death carved instantly through the front ranks, followed seconds later by another round and another as Miller fed ammunition with mechanical precision, each shot erasing clusters of attackers while Okata watched in disbelief as entire sections of his company ceased to exist, formations dissolving into chaos as survivors stumbled over mangled comrades, steel balls lifting men off their feet, tearing through multiple bodies. At close range, the very concept of spiritual invincibility collapsing under the reality of industrial firepower, and within minutes the charge faltered as rear ranks encountered a wall of corpses, momentum bleeding away under the impossible truth that no amount of courage could advance through overlapping cones of steel. Miles away, General Hyakutake, listening as radio contact vanished and sustained American fire told him the assault was failing catastrophically, dawn revealing a clearing. Transformed into a killing field beyond imagination, 783 Japanese dead scattered in arcs that traced the geometry of each shot, while Marine burial parties moved silently among them, and High Tow Tower studied the results with grim understanding, already knowing the weapon had altered the balance of the Pacific War. Reports spreading through Japanese lines describing artillery that fired clouds of metal capable of annihilating companies in seconds, shattering morale so completely that later assaults faltered before they began, forcing doctrinal change throughout the Pacific as Marine Corps manuals incorporated canister employment, arsenals expanded production, and Japanese commanders gradually abandoned mass charges in favor of defensive tactics, the psychological impact rippling through later battles at Edson's Ridge, Tarawa, Saipan, and beyond. Captain High Tow Tower eventually returning home with a Silver Star and spending his career teaching artillery. Sergeant McCullough carrying the memory of that sound into civilian life, and the 37mm gun serving far beyond its original purpose, influencing ammunition design into Korea and Vietnam, standing as proof that on a rain-soaked ridge on Guadalcanal the Pacific War turned not on faith or fury, but on adaptation, precision, and the ruthless efficiency of American industrial ingenuity.